Pope Leo XIV notices a homeless veteran. What he does next leaves everyone speechless. It was one of those rare Roman mornings where the rain seemed to hang suspended in the air, neither falling nor lifting, just lingering with quiet persistence. Tourists huddled beneath a canopy of umbrellas, their voices hushed by the weather as they hurried towards St. Peter's Basilica, eager to escape the damp chill that had settled over the eternal city. Tucked into a shallow alcove at the edge of the square, partially hidden between a souvenir kiosk and a stone column, sat a man the passing crowds pretended not to see. Marco Rossi, hunched forward, his weathered military jacket pulled tight around his shoulders, more for dignity than warmth. The garment was faded to a ghost of its former olive green, the Italian army insignia barely visible on the sleeve, but still worn with a phantom pride that decades of hardship couldn't quite erase. He kept his eyes fixed on the wet cobblestones, watching rivulets of rainwater trace paths between the ancient stones. His cardboard sign, softening in the persistent drizzle, bore simple words in careful script. Afghanistan veteran, God bless you. Occasionally, a coin would drop into the small tin cup beside him, but most people slid their gaze away, mastering the urban art of not seeing what disturbed their comfort. Marco's fingers, once steady enough to disarm explosives in Herat province, now trembled slightly as they brushed against the dog tags still hanging around his neck. 16 years since he'd worn a uniform with purpose, yet he couldn't bring himself to remove this last connection to the man he'd once been. Again with this, a sharp voice cut through Marco's thoughts. Every morning, the same problem. A Vatican. Security guard in a dark uniform stood over him, raindrops beading on his plastic poncho. His face wore the particular expression of someone performing an unpleasant duty they had convinced themselves was necessary. The tourists are complaining, the guard continued, though Marco had heard no complaints. This is a holy place, not a campsite. Move along. Marco didn't look up immediately. The rhythm of this interaction was familiar, almost ritualistic. The same guard, the same words, the same result. Today, however, the guard seemed particularly agitated. Did you hear me? I said move, now. The guard's boot nudged at Marco's cup, sending a few coins skittering across the wet stone. I'm not doing any harm, Marco said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. This isn't a debate. The guard's hand moved to his radio. Either you walk away on your own, or I call for assistance. Marco slowly raised his eyes, meeting the guard's gaze directly. There was something in that look, not defiance exactly, but a distant echo of the dignity that had once been as much a part of him as his heartbeat. I served my country, Marco said, the words emerging as barely more than a whisper. Now I have nowhere else to go. The guard's expression hardened. That's not my problem, he said, already reaching for his radio. Just as the guard's finger pressed the transmit button on his radio, a sleek black sedan with Vatican plates pulled to a stop at the edge of the square. The guard paused, his attention drawn to the unexpected arrival. It was too early for the typical diplomatic visits, and the vehicle lacked the usual security escort. The back door opened, and a small commotion rippled through the sparse morning crowd. Several tourists gasped, phones rising instinctively to capture the moment. From the car emerged a slight figure in simple white robes, his skull cap catching a rare beam of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Pope Leo XIV had developed a reputation for unexpected departures from protocol in the 18 months since his election, but even by those standards, this unscheduled appearance was extraordinary. His security detail emerged from a second vehicle, their expressions a professional mask, concealing clear displeasure at their charge's spontaneity. Your Holiness, the lead security agent murmured urgently, this wasn't on the schedule. We haven't secured the area. The Pope offered a gentle smile that somehow managed to be both apologetic and unmovable. "The rain is letting up, Francesco. I felt called to walk among the people this morning." Marco remained frozen in his alcove, watching the scene unfold with detached curiosity. The spectacle had momentarily suspended his confrontation with the guard, who now stood straighter, his attention divided between his original task and the unexpected papal presence. Pope Leo moved with unhurried purpose toward the basilica, pausing occasionally to greet startled early-morning visitors. He was smaller than he appeared on television, Marco thought, less imposing, but somehow more present. There was an alertness in his gaze that the cameras never quite captured. That gaze now swept across the square and landed with unsettling precision on the alcove where Marco sat. The Pope's eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in focused attention. He changed direction, moving toward Marco with the same unhurried pace. The security guard, who had been confronting Marco just moments before, blanched visibly. "Your Holiness," he began, stepping forward with an awkward half-bow, "I was just addressing a situation with this individual." Pope Leo nodded politely but kept his eyes on Marco. The rain had indeed begun to relent. Individual drops. Now, rather than the previous misty shroud, one fell from the edge of the alcove onto Marco's sign, blurring the word "veteran" into a blue smudge. The Pope's security detail exchanged glances, their training not having prepared them for this deviation. The lead agent moved closer. "Your Holiness, perhaps we should continue to the basilica," he suggested quietly. Pope Leo raised a hand in gentle refusal. "A moment, please," he said, his voice carrying a soft authority that brooked no argument. He stepped closer to Marco, the hem of his white cassock nearly touching the worn boots of the homeless veteran. "Buongiorno," the Pope said simply, his eyes meeting Marco's with unexpected directness. "May I join you for a moment?" Marco blinked, slowly as if emerging from a dream. The world around him seemed to recede. The murmuring tourists, the vigilant security personnel, even the persistent Roman rain, until all that remained in focus was the man in white standing before him. "Your Holiness," Marco managed. The words, rough with disuse, his military training surfaced instinctively as he struggled to rise, to stand at attention before authority. "Please," Pope Leo said, raising a gentle hand, "remain seated. I would join you if you permit it." Without waiting for a response, he lowered himself to the stone step beside Marco, his white cassock pooling around him. The security detail exchanged alarmed glances but maintained their distance, forming a loose semicircle several meters away. Marco shifted uncomfortably, painfully aware of his unwashed clothes, of the sour smell that clung to him after nights on the streets. "I'm not," he began, then faltered, unsure what he meant to say. "Not worthy, not Catholic enough, not the kind of person popes spoke to." Pope Leo seemed untroubled by Marco's hesitation. He sat in silence for a moment, watching the rain lighten over the ancient square. "This alcove," he said finally, "provides good shelter from the storm." Marco nodded cautiously. "The overhang keeps most of the rain off." "You've chosen your spot wisely," the Pope observed, his accent mild but distinct. "A soldier's instinct for tactical positioning, perhaps?" Marco's eyes darted to his sign, now soggy and illegible, then to his worn military jacket. "Afghanistan," he said simply. "Engineers. Explosive ordnance disposal." "Ah," Pope Leo nodded slowly. "A difficult duty. You protected others at great risk to yourself?" Something in the Pope's tone, not pity but recognition, caused Marco's throat to tighten unexpectedly. He stared at his weathered hands to hide the sudden moisture in his eyes. "How long have you been coming to this spot?" Pope Leo asked. 3 months, Marco answered. "Before that, near Termini Station. Before that..." He gestured vaguely, indicating a nomadic existence. A young woman passing by slowed, phone raised. To capture this extraordinary scene, one of the security team stepped forward, gently but firmly directing her to move along. "And before the streets?" Pope Leo asked quietly. Marco's posture stiffened. This was the question he avoided, the dividing line between his former life and whatever this existence was now called. "I had a home," he said finally, "a job, a purpose." The Pope nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "And now?" "Now I have this alcove," Marco said, a hint of bitterness entering his voice. "Until your security guard moves me along." Pope Leo glanced toward the guard who had been confronting Marco earlier. The man looked away, studying the cobblestones with sudden interest. "Marco," the Pope said, surprising him with the use of his name. Had he mentioned it? He couldn't remember. "Would you permit me to ask you something else?" Marco nodded warily. "When was the last time someone truly saw you?" The Pope's question hung in the clearing air, simple but profound. Not as a problem to be solved or an inconvenience to be moved, but as a man with a name and a story. Marco looked up then, meeting Pope Leo's gaze directly for the first time, something long dormant stirring painfully within his chest. Evening shadows stretched across the ancient wood of Pope Leo's private study. The room was modest by Vatican standards, a simple desk of polished oak, walls lined with theological texts, and a single window that looked out over Rome's twilight panorama. Outside, the earlier rain had cleared, leaving the eternal city bathed in that particular golden light that seemed to touch only Italy. Pope Leo stood quietly by this window, his white cassock catching the fading sunlight. The day's official appointments had concluded, but his mind remained fixed on the man he'd encountered that morning. The weathered face, the distant eyes, that had come briefly, painfully alive at the simple act of being seen. "Your Holiness, forgiveness for the interruption." Monsignor Bartoli entered with a soft knock, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. His tall, angular frame and precisely trimmed silver hair embodied Vatican efficiency. "I've brought the briefing for tomorrow's general audience." Pope Leo nodded without turning from the window. "Thank you, Antonio. There is another matter I wish to discuss first." Bartoli approached the desk, his movements measured and deliberate as he always were. "The encounter this morning, I presume. It's already circulating on social media. Communications is preparing a statement." He hesitated briefly. "They are concerned about the unscheduled nature of the visit. I'm less concerned with their concerns than with the man I met," Pope Leo replied, finally turning to face his advisor. "His name is Marco Rossi, former military engineer, served in Afghanistan, now living on our doorstep." Bartoli's expression remained carefully neutral. "Indeed, I've taken the liberty of making inquiries. Our charitable outreach can arrange a place at one of the shelters we support, perhaps a meal voucher program. The standard protocols, Pope Leo interrupted gently, moving to his desk. "Tell me, Antonio, is that what Christ would offer? A voucher?" A nearly imperceptible tightening appeared at the corners of Bartoli's mouth. "Your Holiness, the Church assists thousands of people in need every day through established channels. Systems exist for good reason. Systems exist to serve people, not the reverse." Pope Leo picked up a small silver crucifix that sat on his desk, turning it thoughtfully in his hands. "I want to offer Marco a guest room here in the Vatican." Bartoli's composure slipped momentarily. "Here, Your Holiness, there are security considerations, precedents, questions that would arise." "Good," Pope Leo said simply. "Let them arise. With respect, we know nothing about this man beyond what he's told you. His history, his mental state. I know he protected others, at great risk to himself, and now has no one to protect him." Pope Leo said, his voice soft but firm. "I know he once had purpose, and now has none. I know Christ would not turn him away, and neither shall I." Bartoli drew a measured breath. "Your holiness, your compassion is admirable, but we must consider the practical implications. The Vatican is not a homeless shelter. Your office has responsibilities that extend beyond individual acts of charity, however well-intentioned." Pope Leo placed the crucifix back on the desk with deliberate care. "Do you know what troubled me most today, Antonio? Not that Marco was homeless, though that pains me deeply, but that he was invisible. People walked past him as if he didn't exist, as if his suffering were nothing more than an inconvenient stain on the landscape of their perfect Roman holiday." He moved closer to his advisor, his eyes holding a quiet intensity. "If the Church cannot see the invisible, then what purpose do we serve? If I, wearing these robes, cannot reach out a hand to one man in need, then what meaning do these robes hold?" Bartoli remained silent, the portfolio still clutched in his hands. "Prepare the St. Martha guest room," Pope Leo said quietly. "I will bring him myself tomorrow." The guest quarters in the Domus Sanctae Marthae were simple but dignified, cream-colored. Walls, a narrow bed with crisp sheets, a wooden crucifix hanging above a small writing desk. Through the window, afternoon sunlight cast geometric patterns across the tiled floor, highlighting specks of dust that danced in the quiet air. Marco stood in the center of the room, motionless, as though afraid his presence might somehow contaminate the cleanliness around him. His few possessions, a frayed backpack, the dog tags, a creased photograph, sat beside him on the floor where he'd placed them, unwilling to set them on any surface. "The bathroom is through that door," Sister Agnes explained, her English accented but clear. She was a compact woman in her 60s, with practical hands and eyes that had witnessed decades of human suffering without growing hard. "Clean towels on the shelf, toiletries in the cabinet. Everything is for your use." Marco nodded silently, his gaze fixed on the crucifix. "Dinner is at 7 in the small dining room," she continued. "His Holiness has arranged for a doctor to see you tomorrow morning, if that's agreeable." "I don't need a doctor," Marco said, the words emerging more sharply than he'd intended. Sister Agnes didn't flinch. "Perhaps not, but sometimes it's good to be certain, yes?" She moved to the window, adjusting the curtain slightly. "When did you last have a proper meal, Mr. Rossi?" Marco's hand moved unconsciously to his stomach. "Yesterday. Someone left half a sandwich," Sister Agnes nodded matter-of-factly. "And a full night's sleep in a real bed?" Marco's silence was answer enough. "The body's needs are not shameful, Mr. Rossi. They are merely human." She turned toward the door. "I'll leave you to settle in. Pull the cord by the bed if you need anything." As she reached for the handle, Marco spoke again. "Sister." She paused, turning back. "Why is he doing this?" Marco asked, his voice barely audible. "The Pope. Why me?" Sister Agnes considered the question. "His Holiness sees people, Mr. Rossi. Not titles, not circumstances. People." She smiled slightly. "It is a rare gift." After she departed, Marco remained standing, unable to bring himself to sit on the bed or touch the pristine surroundings. The silence pressed in around him, not the watchful, dangerous silence of the streets, but something deeper and more absolute. He moved finally to the bathroom, catching sight of himself in the mirror above the sink. The face that stared back was a stranger's, hollow-cheeked, eyes shadowed, beard matted and unkempt. He looked away quickly, ashamed. The shower called to him with an almost physical pull. How long since he'd felt truly clean? He turned the handle, letting the water run until steam filled the small space. Beneath the spray, he watched as months of grime swirled toward the drain, yet the sense of contamination remained. Marco braced his hands against the tiled wall, hot water streaming over his bowed head. Then, without warning, a memory surfaced. Dust and heat, the weight of the EOD suit, a child's bicycle lying on its side, the flash, his knees buckled. He slid down the wall to the floor of the shower, water mingling with the tears he'd held back for years. His body shook with silent sobs as the water continued to fall, washing away only what could be seen. Outside in the hallway, Pope Leo paused in his passage, hearing the muffled sounds of grief through the door. His hand lifted, almost touching the wood, then slowly lowered again. Some journeys even a pope must not intrude upon. Instead, he bowed his head briefly in silent prayer, then continued down the corridor, leaving Marco to his private communion with pain long buried. Dawn brushed the Vatican gardens with gentle fingers of gold and amber. Dew clung to the carefully trimmed hedges and ancient statuary, creating a landscape that seemed suspended between heaven and earth. The air carried the scent of cypress and rosemary, a fragrant counterpoint to the distant sounds of Rome awakening. Beyond the walls, Marco walked beside Pope Leo along a gravel path, both men moving at an unhurried pace. 3 days of regular meals and proper rest had begun to reshape Marco's appearance, his posture slightly straighter, his eyes clearer, though still carrying the weight of unspoken memories. He wore simple, borrowed clothes, dark slacks, and a white button-down shirt that hung loosely on his frame. "The gardens are my favorite place to think," Pope Leo said, breaking a comfortable silence. 600 years of popes have walked these same paths, contemplating the same eternal questions. Marco nodded, his eyes following a pair of gardeners pruning roses in the distance. "It's peaceful. The doctor tells me you refused medication," Pope Leo observed, his tone neutral, neither approving nor condemning. Marco's jaw tightened slightly. "Pills don't fix what's broken in me." "No," the Pope agreed, though they might ease the journey. Toward healing, they approached a small stone bench positioned to capture the morning sun. Pope Leo gestured toward it, and they sat together, the intimacy of the moment at odds with their vastly different stations. "When I was in Afghanistan," Marco said suddenly, his voice low, "I made a promise to God, not a formal prayer. I've never been particularly devout, but a promise nonetheless." Pope Leo waited, patient. There was a village, Khairkhana. "We were clearing the area after an IED had been reported." Marco's eyes fixed on something distant, seeing not the gardens, but the dust and heat of another place. "I found a device planted near a school. While I was working to disarm it, a second one detonated." He swallowed hard. 3 children died. "I promised God that if he let me save the others, I would dedicate my life to protecting the innocent." "A noble promise," Pope Leo said quietly. "I failed to keep it." Marco's voice was flat. "I came home, but the nightmares came with me. I couldn't hold a job, couldn't maintain relationships. Eventually, I couldn't even protect myself." He turned to the Pope, his expression raw with unexpected anger. "Where was God then? When I was sleeping under bridges, begging for enough coins to eat, where was this God I'd made promises to?" Pope Leo didn't flinch from Marco's anger. "I ask myself similar questions," he admitted, surprising Marco. "Each time I sign a document that changes too little, each time I speak words that fall short of the real change needed in this world." He gestured toward the majestic dome of St. Peter's visible above the trees. "Sometimes I wonder if we've built magnificent structures to house a faith while forgetting to build adequate bridges to those who need it most." Marco stared at him. "You're the Pope. You're supposed to have the answers." A smile touched Pope Leo's lips. "If proximity to God guaranteed certainty, Marco, these gardens would be filled with the most confident people on earth. Instead, they're filled with seekers, just like you, just like me." "So my promise meant nothing," Marco said bitterly. "On the contrary," Pope Leo replied, his voice gentle but firm. I believe God honors our promises even when we cannot, perhaps especially then. He turned slightly to face Marco more directly. The question isn't whether you've kept your promise in the past, but whether you're willing to renew it now in a different form. Marco looked away, a muscle working in his jaw, but he didn't dismiss the Pope's words, and in that small hesitation, something like possibility flickered to life between them. The Casa dei Veterani occupied a renovated three-story building in Trastevere, its weathered ochre facade blending seamlessly with the surrounding neighborhood. Sunlight played across a modest plaque beside the entrance. For those who served, body, mind, spirit. The front door stood slightly ajar, neither forbidding nor insisting, simply available. Marco hesitated on the threshold, his borrowed shoes. Suddenly fascinating. The Vatican driver who had brought him waited patiently by the car, giving him space to make this journey alone. "You don't have to do this," Marco muttered to himself, even as he recognized the lie. 2 weeks in the Vatican. Guest quarters had been a respite, but not a solution. Pope Leo had been clear. This was the next step. A grey-haired man appeared in the doorway, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "You must be Marco," he said in Italian, his handshake firm and unpretentious. "I'm Paolo Ricci, former Alpini, now just the old man who makes sure this place runs properly." His eyes held the unmistakable knowledge of someone who had seen combat. Inside, the center was unexpectedly bright, walls painted in warm yellows and soft blues. A communal kitchen filled the air with the scent of coffee and fresh bread. Through an open doorway, Marco glimpsed a group of men and women of various ages seated in a circle, their postures speaking of military backgrounds, even in civilian clothes. "Group meets twice weekly, but it's never mandatory," Paolo explained, leading Marco through the building. Physical therapy on the ground floor, apartments upstairs for those who need transitional housing, job training program partners with local businesses. He glanced sideways at Marco. "His Holiness called personally about you." Marco stiffened. "I'm not a charity case." Paolo's laugh was genuine. "Neither was I when I arrived here 6 years ago, sleeping in my car and drinking to forget Sarajevo." He stopped by a window overlooking a small courtyard garden. "The Pope doesn't send many people our way directly. When he does, they're usually the stubborn ones, like me, like you." A woman approached them, her close-cropped hair and direct gaze, suggesting military precision softened by compassion. "Elena Bianchi," she introduced herself, "Army psychologist. I handle intake assessments." She handed Marco a clipboard. "Whenever you're ready, no rush." Marco took the clipboard without looking at it. "I'm only here because someone important asked you to come," Elena finished for him. "That's how most people arrive. What matters is why they stay." In the courtyard below, a young veteran with a prosthetic leg was teaching an older man to navigate steps using a cane. Their faces held concentration rather than pity or shame. Marco's throat tightened unexpectedly. How long since he'd spoken to someone who understood the particular weight he carried? Someone who had also made promises they couldn't keep. "I don't know if I belong here," he admitted quietly. Paolo's hand came to rest briefly on his shoulder. "None of us did at first. That's rather the point." Later that afternoon, Marco sat at the edge of the group circle, not participating but not leaving either. One by one, men and women spoke of nightmares, of civilian relationships that couldn't bear the weight of their experiences, of the particular loneliness of returning from war to a world that preferred comfortable lies about heroism to uncomfortable truths about suffering. Near the session's end, the center's front door opened. Pope Leo entered without ceremony, dressed simply in a black cassock without the usual papal indicators. He didn't interrupt or draw attention, merely took an empty chair at the circle's edge, opposite Marco. Their eyes met briefly across the room. The Pope's small nod contained neither pressure nor expectation, only recognition of the courage it took to sit in that circle, even silently. For the first time in years, Marco felt something unfamiliar expand in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but its quiet predecessor, the possibility that he was not alone in his particular darkness. Morning light filtered through simple cotton curtains, casting soft shadows across the modest studio apartment. 3 months at Casa dei Veterani had earned Marco this space, not a handout but a stepping stone, part of the center's reintegration program. The furnishings were sparse but dignified. A bed with a blue quilt, a small table with 2 chairs, a bookshelf beginning to accumulate volumes on engineering and history. On the wall hung a single framed photograph of Marco's former unit in Afghanistan, their faces young and unbroken by what was to come. Marco stood before the bathroom mirror, razor in hand, contemplating his reflection. The face looking back at him was both familiar and strange, fuller now, with color returned to his cheeks, eyes clearer but carrying the permanent knowledge of things most would never see. His hand hovered at his chin, hesitating. For years, his beard had been both shield and disguise, hiding him from the world and from himself. Removing it felt like more than a cosmetic change. It was an act of emergence, of allowing himself to be seen. The razor made its first path through the shaving cream, revealing skin that hadn't been exposed to daylight in years. Each stroke was deliberate, methodical, the engineer's precision returning to his hands. He worked in silence, focused entirely on the task, until finally the last of the beard was gone. Marco leaned forward, examining the revealed face. The scar along his jawline from the explosion in Kayakana was more visible now, a permanent reminder etched into his flesh. He traced it with one finger, no longer with shame, but with something approaching acceptance. A knock at the door interrupted his contemplation. He quickly wiped away the remaining shaving cream and opened the door to find Lucia Esposito, the center's social worker, clipboard in hand for their scheduled check-in. "Marco," she said, momentarily surprised by his transformed appearance. "Good morning, may I come in?" He stepped aside, suddenly self-conscious. Lucia was in her 50s, with practical clothes and observant eyes that missed nothing without ever seeming intrusive. "I see changes," she remarked, taking the offered chair at the small table. "Not just the beard." Marco touched his smooth chin. "Thought it was time," Lucia nodded, neither praising nor questioning the decision. "How are you finding the maintenance work at the center?" "It helps," Marco said simply. The part-time job repairing the center's facilities had been Paolo's suggestion, using his hands for creation rather than destruction. "I can solve problems. With concrete solutions, things break, I fix them." "And the group sessions?" Marco's expression tightened slightly. "I still don't talk much." "But you attend," Lucia observed, making a note. "That's more than you did 3 months ago." She continued through her standard questions, sleep patterns, anxiety levels, community integration, with Marco providing short but honest answers. The nightmares hadn't disappeared, but they came less frequently now. He'd begun to shop at the local market, exchanging brief pleasantries with the vendors. Small steps, but steps nonetheless. As their meeting concluded, Lucia handed him an envelope. "This came for you through the Vatican postal system." Marco took it, recognizing the simple seal of the Pope's personal office. Inside was a short, handwritten, a note. "The garden paths miss your presence. When you are ready, they await your return, as do I. L." Something shifted in Marco's chest, not the crushing weight of obligation, but the gentle pressure of connection. He folded the note carefully and placed it on the shelf beside his military tags. "He still remembers me," Marco said quietly, more to himself than to Lucia. People who truly see us rarely forget, she replied, rising to leave. At the door, she paused. The man I'm looking at today, Marco, is he closer to who you were or to who you might become? The question lingered in the quiet apartment long after she had gone, as Marco stood once more before the mirror, meeting his own gaze without looking away. The Vatican administrative wing bustled with quiet efficiency, a world of crisp paper and soft-soled shoes moving purposefully across marble floors. Light streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in shafts of gold against the ancient stone walls. Portraits of previous pontiffs gazed down with solemn eyes, witnessing centuries of church business conducted beneath their painted vigilance. Marco sat stiffly in an antechamber, uncomfortably aware of his simple clothes amid such grandeur. He dressed in his best, a navy blazer borrowed from Paolo, pressed khakis, polished shoes, but still felt conspicuously out of place. Beside him sat Elena from the Veterans Center and two other former soldiers from the program, all summoned by the same mysterious invitation. "Any idea why we're here?" whispered Gianni, the youngest of their group, who had lost his right leg in Mali. Marco shook his head. The Pope's note had arrived 3 weeks ago, but this formal summons from the Vatican Secretary's office was unexpected. His fingers unconsciously traced the scar along his jawline, a habit that had replaced tugging at his beard. A door opened, and a slim woman in her 40s emerged. Her tailored suit and pearl earrings spoke of understated authority, while her warm smile softened the formality. "I'm Dr. Francesca Moretti, Deputy Secretary for Humanitarian Initiatives," she introduced herself. "Thank you all for coming. Please, follow me." She led them into a conference room where sunlight spilled across a polished table. Maps and documents were arranged in precise stacks. On the wall hung a large poster bearing the Vatican seal and the words "Invisibili non più international, Conference on Veteran Reintegration." "In 6 weeks," Dr. Moretti explained, "the Vatican will host representatives from 27 countries for a conference addressing the challenges faced by military veterans returning to civilian life." She gestured to the materials before them. Policy experts, healthcare professionals, government officials, all gathering to discuss programs and initiatives. Elena leaned forward. "This is unexpected. Veteran affairs isn't typically a Vatican priority." "His Holiness has made it one," Dr. Moretti replied simply. She turned to face the veterans directly. "Statistics and policy recommendations are necessary, but insufficient. The Pope insists that the true experts, those who have lived this experience, must have a central voice." Marco felt the others' eyes shift toward him. Of course they knew. Everyone at the center knew how he'd been found outside St. Peter's, how the Pope himself had intervened. "We would like each of you to address the assembly," Dr. Moretti continued, "to speak about your experiences, both in service and afterward. The difficulties, the failures of existing systems, what actually helped." She looked directly at Marco. "His Holiness specifically requested your participation, Mr. Rossi." The beer room seemed to tilt slightly. Marco could face explosive devices with steady hands, but the thought of standing before dignitaries, of exposing his deepest wounds to public scrutiny, his pulse quickened painfully. "I'm not a public speaker," he managed. "I barely speak in group therapy, which is precisely why your voice matters," Dr. Moretti replied gently. "Those who speak easily are already heard. It's the reluctant voices that often carry the most truth." Marco stared at the conference poster. 6 weeks to prepare. 6 weeks to decide whether to step fully into the light or retreat back into the shadows that had sheltered him for so long. "What exactly would I need to say?" he asked finally. "Your truth," Dr. Moretti answered. "Nothing more, nothing less." She slid a folder toward him. The Pope believes, and I agree, that sometimes the most powerful form of healing comes not just from being seen, but from helping others to see. Marco's hand hovered over the folder, not yet taking it, not yet committing to the path it represented. The scar on his jaw seemed to pulse with his heartbeat, as past and possible future converged in this moment of decision. Crumpled papers littered Marco's apartment floor like casualties of a private war. At his small table, he hunched over a notebook, pen gripped too tightly between his fingers. The lamp cast harsh shadows across the page, where a dozen false starts had been crossed out, each attempt to capture his journey feeling either too raw or too sanitized. 3 children died. He wrote the words, then immediately struck through them, too blunt. My journey from soldier to homeless veteran. Another line crossed out, too formulaic. Marco pushed back from the table, frustration tightening his shoulders. How could he distill years of trauma, invisibility, and gradual redemption into a 10-minute speech? How could words possibly carry the weight of what he had lived? His phone chimed with a message from Dr. Moretti. Final preparation meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m., papal study. 4 weeks of drafting and rehearsing with Vatican communications staff had produced a speech that sounded professional, diplomatic, and utterly unlike Marco's own voice. Everyone had been unfailingly polite, but he recognized the gentle sanitization of his experience, the emphasis on hope over horror, recovery over wreckage. The next morning, Marco found himself once again within the Vatican walls. This time, in Pope Leo's private study, communications advisors arranged papers on the polished desk, while Marco stood awkwardly by the window, watching gardeners tend the grounds below. Marco. Pope Leo's voice came from the doorway, warm with genuine pleasure. It's good to see you. The formal robes of office couldn't disguise the simple humanity that had first connected them in the rain outside St. Peter's. Marco found himself relaxing slightly in the Pope's presence, the artificial tension of the formal setting diminishing. Let's hear where we are, Pope Leo suggested, taking a seat. A communications director handed Marco the latest draft, a neatly typed document with sections highlighted for emphasis. Marco began reading, his voice initially stiff with rehearsed cadence. Distinguished guests, your eminences, your excellencies. The words felt foreign in his mouth, diplomatic pleasantries that could have been spoken by anyone. He continued, through carefully crafted paragraphs about the challenges of veteran reintegration and institutional support mechanisms. Halfway through, Pope Leo raised his hand gently. May I see the draft? Marco handed it over, relieved to stop. The Pope scanned the document silently, his expression thoughtful. Then, to everyone's surprise, he folded the paper in half and set it aside. This is very well written, he said diplomatically to the communications team, but I wonder if I might have a few minutes alone with Marco. The advisors exchanged glances, but quickly gathered their materials and exited. When the door closed, a different quality of silence filled the room, not the tense anticipation of performance, but the open possibility of truth. Tell me, Pope Leo said simply, what you would say if no one were listening, if there were no dignitaries, no cameras, no expectations. Marco looked down at his hands. I would talk about the dust, he said quietly, how it gets everywhere in Afghanistan, your eyes, your mouth, under your fingernails, how sometimes I still taste it when I wake from nightmares. Pope Leo nodded, encouraging him to continue. I would talk about how the sound of a car backfiring still makes me drop to the ground, Marco continued, words coming more freely now. How I couldn't hold a job because I couldn't explain to my boss why I had to sit with my back to the wall in the break room. He met the Pope's eyes directly. I would talk about how being invisible was both a torment and a relief. How sometimes I think the homeless man I was might have been more honest than the functioning man I'm pretending to be now." Pope Leo was silent for a moment, considering. "And if those were the words you spoke at the conference?" Marco exhaled, slowly. "People would be uncomfortable. It's not inspirational." "Christ rarely made people comfortable," Pope Leo observed. "Truth seldom does." He leaned forward slightly. "The dignitaries coming to this conference sleep in clean beds every night. They need to be uncomfortable." Marco felt something shift inside him, a permission to speak without filters, to trust that his broken edges might serve a purpose greater than his shame. "Write that speech," Pope Leo said quietly. "The one only you can give. I will ensure no one polishes away its power." Crumpled papers littered Marco's apartment floor like casualties of a private war. At his small table, he hunched over a notebook, pen gripped too tightly between his fingers. The lamp cast harsh shadows across the page, where a dozen false starts had been crossed out, each attempt to capture his journey, feeling either too raw or too sanitized. 3 children died. He wrote the words, then immediately struck through them. Too blunt. My journey from soldier to homeless veteran. Another line crossed out. Too formulaic. Marco pushed back from the table, frustration tightening his shoulders. How could he distill years of trauma, invisibility, and gradual redemption into a 10-minute speech? How could words possibly carry the weight of what he had lived? His phone chimed with a message from Dr. Moretti. "Final preparation meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m., papal study." 4 weeks of drafting and rehearsing with Vatican communications staff had produced a speech that sounded professional, diplomatic, and utterly unlike Marco's own voice. Everyone had been unfailingly polite, but he recognized the gentle sanitization of his experience, the emphasis on hope over horror, recovery over wreckage. The next morning, Marco found himself once again within the Vatican walls. This time, in Pope Leo's private study, communications advisors arranged papers on the polished desk, while Marco stood awkwardly by the window, watching gardeners tend the grounds below. "Marco." Pope Leo's voice came from the doorway, warm with genuine pleasure. "It's good to see you." The formal robes of office couldn't disguise the simple humanity that had first connected them in the rain outside St. Peter's. Marco found himself relaxing slightly in the Pope's presence, the artificial tension of the formal setting diminishing. "Here where we are," Pope Leo suggested, taking a seat. A communications director handed Marco the latest draft, a neatly typed document with sections highlighted for emphasis. Marco began reading, his voice initially stiff with rehearsed cadence. "Distinguished guests, your eminences, your excellencies." The words felt foreign in his mouth, diplomatic pleasantries that could have been spoken by anyone. He continued, through carefully crafted paragraphs about the challenges of veteran reintegration and institutional support mechanisms. Halfway through, Pope Leo raised his hand gently. "May I see the draft?" Marco handed it over, relieved to stop. The Pope scanned the document silently, his expression thoughtful. Then, to everyone's surprise, he folded the paper in half and set it aside. "This is very well written," he said diplomatically to the communications team. "But I wonder if I might have a few minutes alone with Marco." The advisors exchanged glances but quickly gathered their materials and exited. When the door closed, a different quality of silence filled the room. Not the tense anticipation of performance, but the open possibility of truth. "Tell me," Pope Leo said simply, "what you would say if no one were listening. If there were no dignitaries, no cameras, no expectations." Marco looked down at his hands. "I would talk about the dust," he said quietly, "how it gets everywhere in Afghanistan, your eyes, your mouth, under your fingernails. How sometimes I still taste it when I wake from nightmares." Pope Leo nodded, encouraging him to continue. I would talk about how the sound of a car backfiring still makes me drop to the ground, Marco continued, words coming more freely now. How I couldn't hold a job because I couldn't explain to my boss why I had to sit with my back to the wall in the break room. He met the Pope's eyes directly. I would talk about how being invisible was both a torment and a relief. How sometimes I think the homeless man I was might have been more honest than the functioning man I'm pretending to be now. Pope Leo was silent for a moment, considering. And if those were the words you spoke at the conference? Marco exhaled, slowly. People would be uncomfortable. It's not inspirational. Christ rarely made people comfortable, Pope Leo observed. Truth seldom does. He leaned forward slightly. The dignitaries coming to this conference sleep in clean beds every night. They need to be uncomfortable. Marco felt something shift inside him. A permission to speak without filters, to trust that his broken edges might serve a purpose greater than his shame. Write that speech, Pope Leo said quietly. The one only you can give. I will ensure no. One polishes away its power. Crumpled papers littered Marco's apartment floor like casualties of a private war. At his small table, he hunched over a notebook, pen gripped too tightly between his fingers. The lamp cast harsh shadows across the page, where a dozen false starts had been crossed out, each attempt to capture his journey feeling either too raw or too sanitized. 3 children died. He wrote the words, then immediately struck through. Them. Too blunt. My journey from soldier to homeless veteran. Another line crossed out. Too formulaic. Marco pushed back from the table, frustration tightening his shoulders. How could he distill years of trauma, invisibility, and gradual redemption into a 10-minute speech? How could words possibly carry the weight of what he had lived? His phone chimed with a message from Dr. Moretti. Final preparation meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m., papal study. 4 weeks of drafting and rehearsing with Vatican communications staff had produced a speech that sounded professional, diplomatic, and utterly unlike Marco's own voice. Everyone had been unfailingly polite, but he recognized the gentle sanitization of his experience, the emphasis on hope over horror, recovery over wreckage. The next morning, Marco found himself once again within the Vatican walls. This time, in Pope Leo's private study, communications advisors arranged papers on the polished desk while Marco stood awkwardly by the window, watching gardeners tend the grounds below. Marco. Pope Leo's voice came from the doorway, warm with genuine pleasure. It's good to see you. The formal robes of office couldn't disguise the simple humanity that had first connected them in the rain outside St. Peter's. Marco found himself relaxing slightly in the Pope's presence, the artificial tension of the formal setting diminishing. Here where we are, Pope Leo suggested, taking a seat. A communications director handed Marco the latest draft, a neatly typed document with sections highlighted for emphasis. Marco began reading, his voice initially stiff with rehearsed cadence. Distinguished guests, your eminences, your excellencies. The words felt foreign in his mouth, diplomatic pleasantries that could have been spoken by anyone. He continued, through carefully crafted paragraphs about the challenges of veteran reintegration and institutional support mechanisms. Halfway through, Pope Leo raised his hand gently. May I see the draft? Marco handed it over, relieved to stop. The Pope scanned the document silently, his expression thoughtful. Then, to everyone's surprise, he folded the paper in half and set it aside. This is very well written, he said diplomatically to the communications team. But I wonder if I might have a few minutes alone with Marco. The advisors exchanged glances but quickly gathered their materials and exited. When the door closed, a different quality of silence filled the room. Not the tense anticipation of performance, but the open possibility of truth. Tell me, Pope Leo said simply, what you would say if no one were listening. If there were no dignitaries, no cameras, no expectations. Marco looked down at his hands. I would talk about the dust, he said quietly, how it gets everywhere in Afghanistan, your eyes, your mouth, under your fingernails, how sometimes I still taste it when I wake from nightmares. Pope Leo nodded, encouraging him to continue. I would talk about how the sound of a car backfiring still makes me drop to the ground, Marco continued, words coming more freely now. How I couldn't hold a job because I couldn't explain to my boss why I had to sit with my back to the wall in the break room. He met the Pope's eyes directly. I would talk about how being invisible was both a torment and a relief. How sometimes I think the homeless man I was might have been more honest than the functioning man I'm pretending to be now. Pope Leo was silent for a moment, considering. And if those were the words you spoke at the conference? Marco exhaled slowly. People would be uncomfortable. It's not inspirational. Christ rarely made people comfortable, Pope Leo observed. Truth seldom does. He leaned forward slightly. The dignitaries coming to this conference sleep in clean beds every night. They need to be uncomfortable. Marco felt something shift. Inside him, a permission to speak without filters, to trust that his broken edges might serve a purpose greater than his shame. Write that speech, Pope Leo said quietly. The one only you can give. I will ensure no one polishes away its power. The Sala Regia gleamed with centuries of power and tradition, its Renaissance frescoes and gilded ceiling watching over the assembled dignitaries like silent witnesses to history. Banners bearing the conference emblem, Invisibili non più, hung between marble columns. Camera crews positioned discreetly along the walls captured the proceedings for global broadcast, their red lights unwavering. Marco stood in a small antechamber, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Through the partially open door, he could see rows of ambassadors, military officials and humanitarian leaders filling the hall. His borrowed suit felt suddenly too tight, the collar constricting. The folded pages of his speech, his true speech written in his own hand, seemed to burn in his pocket. 5 minutes, Mr. Rossi, whispered an aide. Marco nodded, unable to form words. His eyes sought familiar faces in the crowd. Elena and Paolo from the Veterans Center sat midway back. Monsignor Bartoli stood near the entrance, his expression inscrutable. And at the center of the dais, Pope Leo waited in simple white vestments, his presence a steady anchor amid the sea of formality. Inside Marco's mind, a battle raged. Part of him, the part that had survived by becoming invisible, screamed to run, to disappear back into the anonymous safety of Rome's streets. But another voice, newer yet somehow more authentic, held him in place. Not courage exactly, but something deeper. Responsibility. Mr. Rossi, the aide prompted again. It's time. Marco stepped into the hall. The murmur of conversation faded as he approached the podium. Hundreds of eyes tracked his movement, evaluating, assessing. Under their gaze, he felt the phantom sensation of his dog tags against his chest, a reminder of another uniform, another duty. His fingers trembled slightly as he placed his handwritten pages on the podium. The microphone amplified his uneven breath as he looked out across the expectant faces. The words on the page blurred before him. Marco looked up, away from the prepared text, and found Pope Leo's eyes. The Pope gave him a nearly imperceptible nod, not of instruction, but of recognition, of faith in the truth Marco carried. "My name is Marco Rossi," he began, his voice finding strength not in volume, but in quiet certainty. 7 months ago, I was sitting in the rain outside these walls, invisible. He gestured toward the splendor around them, This room and I existed in the same city, but different worlds. You walked past me, perhaps not you specifically, but people like you, officials, tourists, clergy. You looked through me as if I were made of air. A ripple of discomfort moved through the audience. This was not the polished address they had expected. I was an explosive ordnance disposal specialist in Afghanistan, Marco continued. I disarmed devices meant to kill children, until the day I couldn't. His hand rose unconsciously to the scar on his jaw. 3 children died. I lived. That mathematical imbalance followed me home. The hall was utterly silent now. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. We send soldiers to do impossible things, then expect them to return unchanged. We praise their sacrifice until their wounds become inconvenient. The words flowed, now unfiltered by propriety or politics. I didn't become homeless because I lacked skills or intelligence. I became homeless because I couldn't reconcile the man who came home with the man who left. Marco's eyes moved across the gathered officials, no longer avoiding their gaze but meeting it directly. I stand here today not because I'm special, but because I was seen, truly seen, by one person who chose not to look away. He glanced briefly toward Pope Leo. Invisibility is not a condition that happens by accident. It is a sentence we collectively impose when someone suffering demands more attention than we care to give. As Marco continued speaking, his voice grew steadier, his shoulders straighter. The frightened man in the antechamber receded, replaced by someone new yet familiar, a man stepping fully into the light of his own truth, offering it not in shame, but as testimony. Dawn painted St. Peter's Square in gentle gold, the early morning. Light touching the ancient stones with the same quiet reverence it had for centuries. Tourists had not yet arrived in their usual numbers, leaving the space peaceful, expectant. A fine mist hung in the air, not quite rain, but a soft reminder of its possibility. In the same alcove where Marco had once huddled against indifference, a small group now gathered. A folding table bore thermoses of coffee and simple pastries. Behind it stood Marco, dressed in a navy blue jacket bearing the Casa dei Veterani logo, his posture relaxed yet purposeful. The scar along his jawline caught the morning light. No longer a mark of shame, but a map of survival. "Coffee's hot," he offered to a man who approached cautiously, military bearing visible beneath civilian clothes worn too long. The man accepted the cup with calloused hands, eyes downcast in the particular way Marco recognized all too well, the look of someone trying to remain invisible while still needing to be seen. "You're new here," Marco observed. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. "I'm Marco, Marine, Army," the man replied, surprise briefly overcoming caution. "How did you—" "The way you stand," Marco said simply. "Like you're still at attention even when you're at ease." He gestured to the table. "Eat something. Food first, then paperwork if you want it. No pressure either way." Nearby, Elena spoke quietly with a middle-aged veteran, while Paolo helped a younger man complete forms for transitional housing. The outreach program, born from Marco's speech at the Vatican conference 8 months earlier, operated twice weekly, in the same spot where his own journey had begun. "I don't need charity," the man said stiffly, even as his eyes lingered on the pastries. "It's not charity," Marco replied. "It's recognition." He tapped his own chest where dog tags once hung. "Service leaves marks, whether we can see them or not. Some of us just have a harder time transitioning back." The sound of camera shutters clicked nearby. Journalists still occasionally documented the program, particularly when dignitaries visited. Marco no longer flinched at their presence. His story had become a bridge between worlds, his words at the conference rippling outward in ways he could never have imagined. The man hesitantly took a pastry. "How do you do it?" he asked suddenly. "Go from this to whatever comes next?" Marco considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. By remembering that invisibility isn't the same as disappearance. We're still here, still whole, even when broken. He gestured toward the volunteers around them. And by allowing yourself to be seen, even when it's the last thing you want. A familiar black sedan pulled up at the edge of the square. Pope Leo emerged, dressed simply in a black cassock, his skullcap catching the morning light. He didn't approach immediately, but stood watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. Marco noticed him and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. No longer the desperate gratitude of the drowning, but the mutual respect of equals united in purpose. The Pope returned the gesture, his smile conveying more than words could express. "That the Pope?" the veteran asked, eyes widening. "That's Leo," Marco replied simply. "He sees people where others see problems." Later, as the morning progressed, and more veterans arrived, Pope Leo joined Marco at the table. They worked side by side, no ceremony separating them, both performing the sacred task of recognition, of seeing the humanity in each person who approached. "Full circle," the Pope observed quietly, handing Marco another stack of cups. Marco nodded, surveying the alcove that had once been his reluctant shelter. "Not a circle," he corrected gently. "A spiral. We returned to where we started, but never as the same person." In the distance, the bells of St. Peter's began to toll, their sound cascading across the square, calling the faithful to remember what truly mattered. Marco listened to their music with new ears, no longer the background noise of a world that had rejected him, but a reminder that even the most enduring institutions could, with courage and compassion, learn to truly see the invisible.